All right, we're joined with Gentry Humphrey, the VP of Jordan Footwear. Started at Nike back in the early 90s, has been there ever since. Thanks for joining us, G.
My pleasure, my friend, my pleasure.
Mike had his signature shoe line, and then that became a model that everybody around the industry started to follow. But what was the kind of sauce that made him that secret weapon?
Well, it starts with Michael himself. So if you know anything about Michael Jordan, he is not like the guy next door. He's far from it. You know, whenever you have someone who's not afraid of doing things different or breaking the conventional ways of doing things, that's usually puts you in a place where you can kind of start trends or create the future. You combine that with a fabulous designer like Tinker Hatfield, who also thinks in that similar zone of like taking you to places that you didn't think you could go. Sometimes you have to reel him in a little bit, but for the most part, he's the master of like really pushing the limits and trying to move us into different spaces. And then myself, I just kind of have always been that guy that didn't mind being different. Really, all of that together became the secret sauce. And, you know, I think one of the things that I always used to tell people is all of us having the ability to be comfortable with being uncomfortable at times was really what made us push the limits and strive to do things that people just weren't used to seeing.
How did you guys approach just the industry really trying to catch up to what the Air Jordan stood for from a design standpoint?
Quite honestly, we didn't even really care what the industry was doing. It was, our main focus was to make sure that we put a product on Michael, the best player at the time that we felt in the game. The goal was to make sure that we made him get through a 82-game season plus the playoffs, and we allowed him to play at the highest level. And if we could do anything to enhance that play, that was the first thing it was all about.
As I'm thinking of the 11, 12, 13 run, which was kind of that second three-peat, you guys are referencing patent leather, you're referencing women's dress shoes, like watches. It was all over the place. Like, how did that really come from an inspiration standpoint?
Yeah, well, each one of those projects individually had their own point of inspiration, and each actually had their own point of functionality. You know, after the 11, we learned a lot of things about performance and what we needed to help Michael extend his play on the court. And so the 11 really became the foundation of, to me, what performance greatness was going to be in a truly high-performing basketball product. You know, a lot of people know it for the patent leather, but the patent leather was ultimately the complementary piece to the functionality of it in the carbon fiber plate. That was really the start of it. Some people may not know that Michael had developed plantar fasciitis, which is where the tendons underneath the arch start to stretch out and the arches start to collapse. In order to prevent that, we had to create that plate that was going to allow him to be able to sustain the rigors of a season. So that was the first part, you know, really we looked after. From there, it was like, you know, Michael had actually wanted to put patent leather on the 9, and we weren't even ready for the 9. When you talk about being comfortable with being uncomfortable, we were hella uncomfortable. But you know, when we were able to apply a performance benefit to it, you know, because all of the leather that we had been using on shoes prior, you know, leather starts to stretch out, and you always see those images where a player goes to make a cut and his foot is sliding off the footbed and it looks like he's about to break his ankle. And we're like, well, this actually, the nature of patent leather, because it doesn't stretch like a full grain leather, actually serves a true functional purpose. And so not only was it very visually arresting, but it was a performance benefit that we applied to the upper. So, you know, it was a great combination of like outsole, midsole, upper that really allowed us to get to a great place. And obviously visually very aggressive for the time and very different where people hadn't seen it. And ultimately, you know, it filled kind of Michael's dream of, you know, wanting to see people wear a basketball product on the court and then potentially wear it with a tuxedo.
Yeah. I want to talk just about your personal reaction watching The Last Dance. What was it like just when you first heard this was even going to be happening?
To be honest with you, I was a little nervous. You know, but I was actually excited at the same time because, you know, I've had the pleasure of working with Michael for almost 30 years now. And, with that comes, a lot of behind the scene things that people never see. And I get to see the personal side of him. And I think through this documentary, people got a chance to see that. For me, it was like total reminiscing. So and I think about probably three things the most. The first one is, I heard this quote before, and this quote was saying, mastery begins with humility. I don't know who said it, but I remember the quote. And when I looked at the documentary, that's really what I saw, because people never get to see the humility that Michael has. They know him for his intense passion. He's ruthless when it comes to winning. But he has that great balance, and how it started out at a really young age with how his parents brought him up. And if you go through the docuseries, you see that kind of became the foundation of who he is. I think the second thing is for me, it was, we all know how great Michael is as a basketball player. His accolades speak for themselves. But it's pretty amazing to think that had the business side of basketball and how egos that related to that organization, had they just been a little bit more in check, it could have been even greater than what we even know. And then the third thing for me, the soundtrack was banging. Like the Eric B. and Rakim put to all those highlights, and to let all the young generation kind of really see what MJ was all about back in the day, how he played the game. The athleticism and the finesse that he brought to the game, put to, LL Cool J, Eric B. Rock. Man, to me, it was bananas.
In the moment of that 97 season, like, how would you describe his demeanor away from the court? I mean, you're seeing kind of the stress of dealing with Scottie being injured and what was going on the floor, but like, what was he like off the floor at that time?
So I knew some of the things that were happening, but I didn't know them to the in-depth detail that kind of was shown.
Yep.
And so for me, I started again. When I say reminiscing, I went back and I could think about times when, I'd go down and sit in Chicago and start to talk to him about, projects that we're working on. And, before we even get started, like, what's up, man? You good? Small talk. And he goes, oh, man, it's been hell. And now it puts a new perspective on that.
The one thing I was really curious about was, like, how far along did you guys know that was actually going to be his last season with the Bulls, and how did that impact the planning?
MJ hinted to it. He never told us, and I don't think, he knew with 100% himself that it was going to be it for him, but he felt obviously really, really strong about it. And so we knew fairly early on. Thank God he gave us a little bit of warning that time, because the first time he gave us no warning.
The start of that season in 97 was when the Jordan brand actually launched. There's the famous press conference. They all got the awesome suits on. The 13s were unveiled. So how far along was that really planned out, and what did it mean to launch the Jordan brand at that time?
Well, obviously it was really big because, we were preparing for the future. It was the first time that you could really start to say that, we knew that the Jordan logo had a ton of equity in it. Not only was it a logo that represented basketball, but it was a logo that represented a man, and a man who created excellence throughout his career. And so it was important for us to sustain that. And that was the foundation for it. We bring in guys like Ray Allen, Eddie Jones, Derek Anderson, all the young bucks who had a little piece of Michael in their game, was able to kind of cut through with young consumers who we felt were going to be they needed someone to relate to as Michael slowly started to walk away from the game. And so that foundation was key. It's much like that today. We're staying connected with consumers, bringing folks like Zion to the table, and young guns of today who kids can kind of connect with.
And you mentioned a couple of those names. I mean, you guys started with 5 guys. I always heard KG was one of those, and obviously he was wearing some team stuff, Jumpman Pros, and that was one of my favorite guys growing up. So that was always like a great what if.
Well, actually, to be honest with you, KG was kind of the first before we even announced it in the brand. So I remember going down to meet with MJ when we dropped a shoe called the Jumpman Pro.
Yeah.
First time we did basically a team version, we felt we had to have an athlete attached to it. And so we talked about KG, and I remember specifically going down to speak with KG about having him wear the shoe. MJ was on board at the time. When we connected with him, it just so happened that the following year or two later, his contract was up, and then he ended up jumping ship.
You had the 13, you had the commercials around it. For me, I love the Black Cat inspiration. What can you tell us in terms of like the kind of insights that drove the 13 that season?
Yeah, so it's exactly what you said. So a lot of people may or may not know this, but MJ, by the guys in the league, was called the Black Cat. And if you think about how he moved on the court, I mean, he was, pretty relentless on the court, very smooth, stealth-like, but could strike at any given time and, strike with aggression. But for us, we literally took it literally. We took the notion of the Black Cat and use that to create the product. I think if you look at the shoe, you pull up the bottom of the shoe, the first thing you notice is that it looks almost like a cat's paw.
Mm-hmm.
And we started looking at the science of how cats move and how their paws allow them to move from point A to point B with efficiency. And those flex grooves that we brought into the outsole of the shoe really started to mimic how the cat's paw articulates. And so that became kind of the first point of like, okay, we create a great traction story with this, with great articulation. And now we're going to hopefully create, that space that Michael needs to give him that competitive advantage by allowing him to get from point A to point B quicker than the next guy. That became kind of the first point of inspiration. And then when you move up into the midsole, you see that it kind of has that paw-like aesthetic to it, and the pods that we brought to the outsole. I think one of the cool things we brought to it that hadn't been done at the time is we fabric wrapped it with suede, so you never really saw suede midsoles on shoes, and so that was the first for us. And then you bring it with an upper that had support in all the right areas, but it had that kind of classic styling that allowed it to be very minimalistic as well. And the whole thing came together and it worked well.
That kind of really brings us to that 98 season where, yes, he's wearing the 13s the whole year, but game 3, game 6, he debuts the 14s early.
Yeah.
What was kind of the thought process behind that and how'd that all come to life?
We had an opportunity to kind of showcase him in something a little bit different. And also knowing that this literally could have been the last dance.
And by that point, you knew like that was it?
Yeah. Yeah. So like, hey, why not?
And what was it about the 14s, just from a design standpoint, that kind of took a different spin from what the 13 was?
The inspiration itself was a little bit different. We all know that the automobile industry, especially Michael, is near and dear to all of us. Cars are kind of like shoes,
Michael, because he does buy them in twos.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I buy shoes in twos from that standpoint. But that's
yep. But the 14 was inspired by a Ferrari that Michael had. Tinker did a masterful job at bringing details to it that drafted directly from the car. Everything from keeping the stability elements where you needed in the outriggers that are on the midsole. But we gave them kind of that first time the industry had ever seen like a high gloss paint being brought to footwear. And it was obviously mimicking the paint on the car, all the way down to the vents. How do you keep the shoe breathable? On the medial side, you've got that vent that mimicked kind of the air duct of the Ferrari. It was just so the quilting details of the seats and how that became a part of the upper logo itself. I mean, there were so many things that was just a great fit on that shoe. When you draw the analogy of the Ferrari and how Michael moves, what his favorite car was at the time. And Michael actually came to us with that, and he said, hey, got this new car you guys gotta see.
What was the pressure like year to year when you're trying to follow up basically a great series at that point?
Man, I can't tell you how the pressure is ridiculous. I mean, it is super, super hard. I mean, I think people underestimate, the difficulty in creating something that is hopefully going to be groundbreaking every single year. But yeah, it's a lot of pressure.
I'm really curious too, just where were you for game 6? And did you realize, like, once he hit that shot, the actual impact and the iconic nature of it?
Yeah, it was one of those deals where I was at a friend's house. It was several of us watching the game. And, I think what people forget is like every game, every single game that Michael played, you were fixated on him playing, because you didn't want to miss something spectacular. But that game in particular, it was bananas because you can't write a better ending. I mean, it just doesn't get any better than that.
And did you guys like the fact that the shot was in the 14 and it was going to be something that was down the road? Or
for me, I'm like, yes. Everybody wants what they can't have. And you couldn't get your hands on it if you really liked it, because as soon as he debuted, everybody was like, what the heck is that? No one was really expecting it. And so what better way to go out with someone wanting to figure out how they're going to get their hands on it.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.